you know, it's not new, this sort of remote, weird places to have the international summit. I think it's also testimony to one thing that the anti-capitalist movement did, which was to drive these institutions and these people out of the cities. Now, you know, that may be an only temporary thing. I think they're trying to creep back in one way or another. But I think it's important because it symbolises as well the fact that the anti-capitalist movement managed to do a huge degree of damage in terms of the credibility of the international financial institutions, and presumably by implication to the system that these institutions promote and try and organise. I was looking back at some of the opinion polls that were taken at the time. I mean, when the movement erupted, it wasn't just a sensation on the left and in the sort of Labour movement and so on. It was a sensation for the ruling class as well. I mean, it's interesting going back looking at the front page articles of, you know, it was almost panic actually on the part of the establishment about these apparently spontaneous, huge protests that were taking place. And there was one opinion poll in the Financial Times at the height of the anti-capitalist movement in 2001, which showed just after the massive general protests, which were, there was an attempt to demonise them as being extremely violent and led by mad anarchists, you know, troublemakers and so forth. Nevertheless, this opinion poll showed that in 7 countries around Europe, which were the only countries they looked at, there was an average 70% of sympathy for the protesters at the G8 and the other anti-capitalist protests. So, you know, it's clear that they were the protests were kind of expressing a very wide and broad feeling, and also, I guess, that suggests as well that they had kind of, by articulating an anger and a mood, they actually helped to spread an anti-capitalist and anti-neoliberal critique. The second thing is, I'll mention in passing, I mean, this is another long and contentious discussion really that I could open up here, but the protest had a disorganising effect, a concrete disorganising effect on the world financial system. Not just in the sense that these poor people had to go and, you know, go to islands and get away from population centres in order to meet, but a bit more fundamentally. This was perhaps best exemplified at Cancun, at the WTO in Cancun in 2003, where with big protests taking place outside the summit, some of the representatives of the smaller, weaker countries in the world economy actually rebelled against the terribly unfair terms that were being imposed on them, trade terms that were being imposed on them by the big powers of the WTO, walked out of the ministerial, and actually refused to agree any kind of trade agreement, international trade agreement, which actually led to the complete paralysis of the Doha round, and in many ways stymied, at least at that institutional level, the attempt, the kind of project of the WTO to impose unilaterally across the board the kind of trade terms that the big powers wanted. Third and finally, in terms of the achievements, in many ways, perhaps most importantly, the anti-capitalist movement put protesting back into the mainstream, radical protesting back into the mainstream. And I actually think this has wider implications than just the whole question of making demonstrations something that were attractive and you know, important in society. The police murder, famously, the police murder of Carlo Giuliani, the young activist at Genoa, actually led to a massive reaction in Italy. It led to, within days, actually, huge demonstrations taking place in every city, in every town across the country. And that in turn led to a kind of radicalisation of Italian society. It led actually directly to the revitalisation for an important period of the Italian left, and it led as well to a situation where a year or so later there were massive mass or even general strikes taking place over semi-political issues in that country that actually rocked the regime. That's a well-known history. In a sense, slightly less well-known or less discussed is the fact that there was a similar kind of dynamic between the anti-capitalist protest and wider protests or even and industrial action and strike action and so forth in other countries as well. In France, from in each country and its own history, but from 1995 onwards, there was a kind of dynamic interplay between the anti-capitalist mobilisations and various different important waves of industrial unrest. In Spain, I mean, one of the high points for me, actually, in the whole experience of the anti-capitalist movement was the developments in Spain in 2003, when a series of protests against the neoliberal policies of the European Union, which was meeting at the time, that year, in Spain, a series of mass protests, I'm reading they were mass protests, 600,000 people demonstrating in Barcelona in 2003, which is a relatively small city, I can't remember, I think 3 million people, so that's a huge protest, led a few months later to a general strike on the day that the European Union actually met in Spain, against the whole plethora of neoliberal measures that the European Union was trying to impose. I mean, these were fantastically significant events that actually, and this relationship between the anti-capitalist movement and the wider labour movement was an incredibly dynamic and incredibly profound one in many places. And similar, although obviously specific history can be spoken about in other countries in Europe and beyond, no doubt. By the way, I think it has to be mentioned as well that I think the anti-capitalist movement was a launch pad. Clearly, it was a launch pad for the massive demonstrations against the war and the incredible ambition of the anti-war movement wouldn't, I think, have been possible. And actually the radical nature of the anti-capitalist movement, the anti-war movement, which from the beginning in many countries had this anti-imperialist flavour. I don't think any of that would happen if it hadn't been for the initial history of the anti-capitalist protests and so forth.